I am Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Book 101 Review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years. And today I have my special guest. He's the author of the book Through the Gates of Hell, none other than Mr. Joshua Colangelo-Bryan.
Hello.
Welcome, Mr. Josh. And can you please introduce more about yourself that I miss?
My name is Josh Colangelo. I am special counsel at Human Rights First in New York. I do litigation relating to civil rights and human rights issues. I also do advocacy and investigations outside of court settings relating to those issues. And among the many cases I've handled over the years was the representation of 6 detainees at Guantanamo Bay, which started many years ago. Yet, interestingly enough, we find ourselves now in 2025 seeing the U.S. sending more people to Guantanamo for the first time in decades. So I think it's an interesting moment to talk about this topic.
Indeed, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world, Mr. Josh. The book's title frames Guantanamo as hell. For the prisoners you profiled, what are the specific daily realities that made it a living hell beyond the physical interrogation techniques?
In a sense, the most profound challenge that our clients had was being locked up incommunicado, thousands of miles away from their families indefinitely without ever being charged or tried for any criminal activity or even accused of taking action against the U.S. When you're being held indefinitely and you have no idea when or if you would be released and sent back to your family, the psychological stress of that is really quite intense. In a more day-to-day sense, a number of our clients were held in very isolating conditions where they spent 23 hours a day by themselves in solid wall cells. So the combination of having no idea what your future held or whether you'd ever be released, along with that solitary daily existence, in some respects was even harder than physical abuses that our clients experienced.
Mr. Josh, your book gives names and stories to men known for a decade only by numbers or each detainee. Which individual story most fundamentally charged or changed your own understanding of Guantanamo and why?
So in a sense, the heart of the story that the book tells is about a very deep friendship that, much to my surprise, I developed with a particular client. He was the first client I ever met at Guantanamo. I was a little bit worried about whether I was going to be going in and sitting down with some hardcore terrorist. But when I went into that first meeting, I saw Jaber, a very diminutive man who gave me a very broad smile when I walked in. He stood up, or he tried to stand up to shake my hand, but he was shackled by one leg, so he couldn't quite do it. And very quickly, we found ourselves in an easy, almost personal conversation. That was the start of a relationship, a friendship that really developed over the next years. as I would come down to visit him, being his only connection to the outside world. And as we tried to get relief for him and the rest of our clients. So I think it was that personal relationship that was completely unexpected, that most strongly demonstrated just how wrong it was when the U.S. government was describing everyone at Guantanamo as the worst of the worst.
Hmm. So, Mr. Josh, a key part of our injustice is the experience of the forever prisoner. Cleared for release but still held. How does indefinite detention with no charge and no end in sight destroy a person psychologically as you witness?
So, as I was talking about, that was maybe the hardest part of this experience for clients, being told that they could be held potentially forever, having no idea what the future would bring to them. And those were people, my clients, who were detained for a period of 5 years or so, which certainly is very long. But there were many other people in similar circumstances held at Guantanamo for much longer, including a few who are still there today. I honestly don't know how people have the strength to continue going under those sorts of circumstances. I mean, one can only imagine the anxiety and fear and lonely desperation that one would feel if you had no idea whether you were ever going to make it out of this island prison and back to your family.
So, Mr. Jones, beyond the prisoners, what is the human cost for the service members, lawyers, and interpreters who have served others fought against Guantanamo? What toll did the system take on the Americans involved?
Well, there were, you know, certainly members of the military who served at Guantanamo and later spoke out about their experiences. People who were told at the start of their tour in Guantanamo that they would be guarding the world's most dangerous terrorists, and then slowly came to see that most of the people at Guantanamo didn't match that description at all. I've spoken to a number of guards who have expressed serious regret about how they behaved when they had a incorrect understanding of who was being held. Just by way of another example, there was one point when my client Jaber, the one who features most prominently in the book, was feeling very desperate and suicidal, in fact. At one point during a break in a meeting that we had, he managed to hang himself by his neck from the top of his cell wall and cut a large gash into his arm. When I went back into the meeting room earlier than he expected and saw him hanging by his neck, I was able to call for help. We got him down. He had surgery and he survived. Years later, I read an account by a therapist who had been treating people who had served at Guantanamo, and he described a sergeant who witnessed that very suicide attempt, and described just how distraught the sergeant was and how he carried that experience with him. So there are very real human consequences for those who are made to carry out the orders that kept Guantanamo operating, even when they weren't the people who were creating those plans.
Mr. Jones, the book argues this was American injustice. Why or how was Guantanamo's very creation of sovereign Cuban land leased by the U.S. a deliberately legal strategy to create a lawless zone?
So the Bush administration's theory was that if it held foreigners who it could grab anywhere in the world, um, if it held them in Guantanamo, it could argue that someone who's not a U.S. citizen, not being held in U.S. sovereign territory, had no ability to go to a U.S. court and ask for any help. That question, that position was litigated for several years until the U.S. Supreme Court said, well, Guantanamo is not sovereign U.S. territory, but it's an area that we completely control. And according to our interpretation of the U.S. lease with Cuba, we will control it potentially forever. And as a result, even though it's not sovereign U.S. territory, it is essentially a U.S. territory. It's under the U.S. government's exclusive jurisdiction and control. And therefore, U.S. courts do have authority to hear claims made by people who are being held there. But the original idea was to create a prison outside the law where the government could do whatever it wanted in order to interrogate people. It could hold people under whatever conditions it saw fit. It could hold them, again, potentially forever without charges or a trial or even a fair hearing. So that was the reason that those 45 square miles in southern Cuba were picked to house this detention operation.
You detailed the legal confrontations used to justify detention and interrogation. What is the most shocking or brazen example you found of the government manipulating or inventing law to sidestep the Constitution and Geneva Conventions?
Well, as I said, the Supreme Court issued this decision saying very clearly that U.S. courts could hear claims by detainees. So most people thought that meant a detainee could go to court, demonstrate his innocence, see if the government had any evidence against him, and a judge would then make a decision about whether the person should be held or not. The government had different ideas. And so right after that Supreme Court decision that I mentioned, it took a different but very similar position to the original position that the Supreme Court had rejected. The government said, okay, we understand that courts in America have authority to hear claims brought by detainees, but those detainees are still foreigners and they're held outside U.S. sovereign territory, so they don't have any rights that they could assert in a claim. As a result, courts are empowered to accept a complaint from a detainee, but they have to then dismiss it immediately. The government's argument was a pure formality. Unfortunately, in order to resolve that issue, it took additional years of litigation and another trip to the Supreme Court. Ultimately, about 4 years passed before the government's second argument, which looked very much like its first argument, was rejected. So that's a really broad example of the litigation tactics that the government employed. A more concrete example I could offer relates specifically to Jaber, the client who I speak about most in the book. after the suicide attempt that I witnessed, we were very aware that his desperation was in large part because he was being held in very isolating conditions. So we asked the court to direct the military to give him just some additional opportunities for basic human interaction. The government did not want the court to do that. It opposed our request. And one of the arguments it made was that Jaber was not isolated at all because, in fact, he had very pleasant interactions with his interrogators, which included eating pizza and playing checkers. Now, I think it's the first time, or at least it was the first example we could find of an argument that someone is not being isolated because they get interrogated. Beyond that, the way Jaber described the interrogations, they weren't a party, which is really how the government was describing it. When we initially saw that argument by the government, we really couldn't believe the chutzpah, to use a word that you hear in New York a lot, for the government to say that, our client had a great social life because he was getting interrogated.
What role did secrecy and classification play as a tools of injustice, Mr. Josh? How has the state's ability to declare information secret used to prevent accountability and keep the truth from the public and even the defendant's own lawyers?
So, again, Guantanamo was selected because, in part, the government believed that it could keep secret everything that was happening there. It was several years after people were first detained at Guantanamo that lawyers were able to go down and start to uncover the truth about what had been happening. But even when that began, classification, secrecy issues were a very big deal. Just for example, the rules under which we could travel to the base and talk to clients said very specifically that anything a client said to us, anything at all, was presumptively classified. That includes if a client told you that he stubbed his toe or spoke about something that had happened when he was a child. Literally anything they said was classified. In order to use that information in a more public way, we had to submit records to a particular government team, which would assess whether the information should be declassified. As you can imagine, there were plenty of fights in that context between the government and lawyers who were trying to get information that was not legitimately classified before the public, so that people could understand what was going on. But that system of classification created a lot of obstacles, and again was part of the government's general plan to keep everything that happened at Guantanamo a secret. And it's pretty obvious why the government would want to do that, of course.
Mr. Josh, as an author, what are your short-term and long-term goals?
So there was a certain demagoguery at work in the post 9/11 Guantanamo operation. The idea really was that any Arab man that the U.S. captured, including when it paid bounties for people, was one of the worst of the worst. And so to protect Americans, those people had to be locked away without any rights. Over the years, we saw that whole narrative fall apart. Not even a majority of people at Guantanamo were ever actually accused, forget what could be proven, not even accused of taking action against the U.S. Moreover, the human stories that came out, I think, clearly established that we were hardly talking about a group that was uniformly the worst of the worst. Today, the U.S. government is adopting a very similar strategy in terms of vilifying groups of people. And obviously, one group of people that is being vilified by this government is immigrants. And in fact, we have seen immigrants sent from the U.S. to Guantanamo in 2025. So the dynamics that underpinned the Guantanamo operation after 9/11 and the dynamics that are animating a lot of what the government is doing now in terms of immigrants are really very similar. I hope the book is just a small example of what happens when you get to know people individually who are part of a vilified group that we are told is uniformly evil. Once you get to know people in that group, then the narrative, the demonization, it really falls apart because it is essentially always unsustainable factually. And that's what I hope the book in a small way demonstrates.
Good luck to your goals, Mr. Jaws, and looking forward for more success. And what will be your piece of advice for those people out there who want to be an author like you?
It's a book I never could have written if I hadn't kept very substantial records about everything we did. That was a natural part of handling a case as a lawyer, but it allowed me to present information about things that happened in some instances, many years ago in an accurate way. So I realize this may not be a very inspiring literary idea, but for anyone at least who is thinking about nonfiction, particular a nonfiction memoir, I think the idea of creating a record of what happened that you can rely on in the writing process is really important.
Well, thank you for that advice, Mr. Jaws. And the gates of hell is a powerful metaphor for readers who finish your book feeling a sense of outrage and despair. What do you hope they do that feeling? What is the call to action?
Well, the one thing I will point out in that context, not to spoil the ending, but there is actually a happy ending to this story where eventually we are able to get Jaber and the rest of our clients home. And now, almost 20 years later, we are still friends. We're still in touch. I have visited him and his family at home. But having said that, you're right that there certainly is despair reflected in the book. For people who are concerned about these issues, I think you want to be doing whatever you feel able to do, whether it's protesting, whether it's writing to your congressional representatives, whether it's donating a little bit of money to an organization that is involved in trying to push back against the government, volunteering your time at one of those organizations. I think all of those things actually make it easier to navigate through a period like this when many of us are really troubled about what's happening. Doing something, I think it really benefits not only the people we're trying to help, but us as we take those actions.
Well, empowering answer, Mr. Josh. And before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, people. My other podcast, because my abstract essay is already in fifth season, abstract poetry in its third season, and of course, my book 101 review in its sixth season this year, comedy 101 third season, and my food 101 in sixth season as well. Geography 101, Love Letters, Movie 101, Review, Music 101, our fourth season, Science 101, Sex 101 in its third season, and my baby podcast, Trivia 101, Law 101, Mental Health 101, Motivation 101, Entrepreneurship 101, and Bible Verses 101. Please listen to them wherever you listen your podcast. So ultimately, Mr. Josh is Through the Gates of Hell, story about tragic policy failure, or is it story about the fundamental character of American power in the 21st century? What is the deeper truth you want to readers to take away?
Anyone who wants to live in a functioning democracy needs to be very careful when they hear their government describing an entire group of people as criminal or evil or the worst of the worst, and then subjecting those people to a diminution of their legal rights. Whenever that has happened in U.S. history, we have looked back on it with regret, whether it was locking up Japanese Americans during World War II, McCarthyism, even the post 9/11 Guantanamo operation. We always see in retrospect that it didn't make us any safer and it caused lots of human harm. So I hope that we all can remain vigilant and listen very critically and carefully when a government starts telling us that it has to treat some group of people in a really cruel way because all of those people are out to harm us. Essentially, that's not something that is ever accurate factually, and it leads to policy decisions that, as I say, we always look back on with regret.
Yes, definitely. Always there's a regret. So, Mr. Joshua Colangelo-Bryan, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. So can you please invite our listeners to support your book, your advocacy, or whatever projects that you're doing right now?
Anyone who thinks this book sounds interesting, it is available on through all of the normal platforms. If you go to the Simon and Schuster website, search for the book, all of that information will be available. And certainly I invite people to take a look at the work that Human Rights First, my organization, is doing to protect the rule of law, to protect democracy, to push back against all kinds of excesses that we see coming from the U.S. government today. And thank you so much for having me. It was great to talk to you.
You're most welcome, Mr. Josh. So, I have one more question. For the man still detained, what does a path to any semblance of justice or resolution look like now? Is it apology or a resettlement even possible?
I think there probably is no way that meaningful justice can be done at this point. And what I might point out is that right now, out of the very small number of people being held at Guantanamo, most of them are charged with serious crimes in connection with terrorist activity that killed people. But even the loved ones of those who lost their lives have not seen justice because we haven't had trials for those people. The reason we haven't had trials is because the U.S. government tried to invent a justice system at Guantanamo, which has been a completely failed effort. And so here we are years and years later, and we still have not seen accountability that people whose loved ones lost their lives desperately want to see. And obviously for those who are still being held without charge, I don't know how you could ever effectuate justice for them.
Yes, accountability, people. So, Mr. Josh, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It was great to talk to you.
Marika people, see you soon.